Where the beams cross?
Two.
Thanks, Rich.
Are you the Judean People's Front?
Fuck off.
What?
Judean People's Front. Well, the People's Front of Judea. Judean People's Front. God.
Welcome back to another week of the Pichy and Palscast discussing film. We are back live in the studio as we are recording this, so that's not really live, I apologize. I'm already contradicting myself. What a fool, what an imbecile.
What is even happening?
I don't know. I don't know what's happening. Louis not here. It's just chaos. It's the madness of the long weekend, I tells you.
And we have watched probably the worst film that we have watched so far doing this podcast.
I love that this is happening every week. Like, when I set out to hustle you into doing a film show with me, part of it was I did have a certain degree of schadenfreude and a desire to see how I could break you with the film selections. And it's not in the ways I was expecting it to happen. We haven't even gotten to the real weird artsy stuff. And you're getting killed by just Hollywood. Hollywood is destroying you.
The first movie we're going to talk about pretty soon, I absolutely hated. I think I hated everything about this film. No, that's not true. There were a few parts in the middle, but it's so goddamn long that it's hard to remember the good parts when it's just swamped in such boredom. Yeah.
Yes, we are recording on Saturday, the 31st of March 2018, which puts this as the Saturday after Passover. So depending on your religious affiliations, this weekend is either Passover, the Hebrew holiday celebrating the return from Egypt, or this is Easter, the Christian holiday commemorating the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, or if you are agnostic or atheist, then this is that weekend with all the chocolate.
Yeah, there was no chocolate in any of these movies. Not a single bit of chocolate or eggs at all. So I'm disappointed.
Not particularly surprising, though. I mean, both the films we watched were set in the same year. And that year was approximately 33 AD.
Yeah, you were talking to me about a genre called sword and sandals before you showed me these two films, which I found interesting. I knew what sword and sorcery was, but I hadn't heard of sword and sandals.
Yeah, well, that term began much like shoot 'em up western as a derogatory term. In particular, it tended to refer to Italian biblical epics. The generally accepted term for a long time was biblical epic, which refers to films like Ben-Hur and King of Kings. Films set in antiquity with large scope and very low-key, if any, supernatural elements. Just films about Romans with sandals shanking dudes. At the briefest of terms, but mostly broad, sprawling historical epics. The Ten Commandments would be a better example. Quite a lot of these used stories from the Bible in order to provide their source material. Whereas Sword and Sandal referred more to the Italian films that were happening at the time, where it was basically this period in between different genres of Italian exploitation. And so these came after the spaghetti westerns. I'm sure you're familiar with that term to refer to westerns made in Italy by Italian directors.
Yeah, before we started watching these, before I knew what they were, I will say that Sword and Sandals did sound pretty interesting to me, just because I'm a really big fan of Rome.
You like the Western Roman Empire quite a bit.
I love the Western Roman Empire, and I love it.
Not a Byzantine fan?
Oh no, I do like I like that. Anything that's even tangentially, I like the Holy Roman Empire as well, even though they're like the least connected thing. Just anything that is either that is in any way vaguely connected to Roman history. And I think what's interesting is that I love the history aspect, like just the regular history aspect. But I also love Rome in fiction as well, and all the ways that you can do Rome and how that as a setting and as its own kind of character. There's just so many really fun stories.
There is a certain aesthetic you can use, as well as it being this interesting time of various forms of technological development in farming and plumbing in particular.
Yeah.
It's a time where a great deal of military strategy and history was developed, as well as various, and oftentimes the history of the Roman Empire is as much the story of personal greed bringing long-term negative effects.
Yeah, there's just so much that you can do with it in history and in fiction, and not even just with like just Rome. It can be used as like an aesthetic or as
it's a very distinct aesthetic.
Yeah, but you can also make if you're making a fantasy story or a sci-fi story, it's the kind of thing that you can kind of base a race or a species or a civilization around. It's you can do a lot with Rome, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, and that's kind of the consequence of having such a long-stretching impact on period of history. So the films that we watched were, since it's Passover weekend, I had a list of films that I was thinking of doing, and the first two on the list happened to be ones that Matt had not seen, and so I just went with the simplest ones. Passover weekend, do 2 films which happen to involve Jesus Christ. So we have Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, and Monty Python's Life of Brian. As I say Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, Matt has already got his head in his hands. He does not want to think about this film.
I know that I'm probably starting to repeat myself now. We kind of talked about it at the start of this podcast.
All good.
Sure. Okay, well, I know I'm repeating myself probably a little bit in terms of between podcasts, because I remember saying how much I hated Mrs. Smith Goes to Washington, another like well-known classic movie that everyone who likes film seems to apparently like. And now
I don't like it.
Okay, I mean like everyone in the more broad sense. And here I am again with Ben-Hur, a classic that I know a lot of people revere, and is just a well-known classic Hollywood film.
Oh, in some ways, the definitive Hollywood biblical epic.
Yeah.
But just the sheer scope of some of the work that was put into this film.
And I hated it. I don't even understand how one can make this. I don't understand how someone can make a story like this and think that it's good. Like, I don't understand how. Yes, I do understand that it was an early part of film, that it was a growing medium at that time, but stories have been around for quite a long time when Ben-Hur was created. And it's just such a terribly written and poorly done story.
Well, perhaps we can compare. So, it's an adaptation of a novel written in 1880, entitled Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. But let's keep in mind that Universal's Frankenstein was also built on a late 19th century novel, Frankenstein. And that film's so much more concise and interesting and well told and poignant.
How long was Ben-Hur again? Was it
3 hours and 45 minutes? A true epic.
I feel like when you think of epic, you think of like long journeys and big sweeping things happening to whatever world.
I know what you think of these days. You think of the definitive swords and sorcery movie, Conan the Barbarian.
A much better film than Ben-Hur.
Yeah, because not only is it an epic, like that film is practically an opera in the way it's delivered.
Yeah. Yeah, this it's amazing how much of that time duration in that movie in Ben-Hur is just spent waffling and meandering and just being generally just nothing. There's just so much nothing and what was the word you used? Cruft?
Yes,
Perfect
I think
description.
Yes, cruft is a good word for this one.
Yeah.
Or sleep, as in wiping the sleep from your eyes, getting rid of all the weird condensed salt water.
It's almost like a big wake-up call. Both these old classic movies that you've shown me these last couple of podcasts, Mrs. Smith Goes to Washington and Ben-Hur.
Kill your gods.
Yes, just like a general thought of maybe the classics aren't always good. I was going to say not always perfect, but I don't even think they're flawed movies. I think they're terrible movies. So this is like realizing that these movies that are held in such high regard, at least in my opinion, are just terrible. I hated these movies.
There's an old quote, and I can't remember who to attribute it to, but basically that a key component of growing up is understanding that your parents is just as clueless as you are.
Well, I have to find out whether my parents like this movie. Hopefully not.
I don't mean in that respect.
Oh.
I mean in the sense of things that are respected and seem so grand and powerful. And oftentimes it's people just trying to work things out just as much as you are.
Yeah, there's
And
a real
things that are widely regarded may not be that good. Although the times that they are, it really is special.
Yeah, there's like a real like behind the curtain kind of feeling, like seeing them. But yeah, it was a wake up call watching these couple of movies, and it'll be interesting to see how I go forward watching classic films, like whether I'll have that same kind of level of awe.
Yeah, I'm curious to do The Wizard of Oz now, the good one, the famous one. And yeah, that film, wonderful visuals, but that's also a very long and stretched out and padded film. And that's even with them cutting some unused footage. Like, there's a line where the Wicked Witch of the West announces that she's going to send a little bug to take care of them. And the scene where that bug appears has been completely deleted in the final cut.
Now you're just making me think of what unused footage there could be of Ben-Hur in the 3 hours and 45 minutes movie. What did they cut anything?
Do you remember that establishing shot of a desert?
Yeah.
That's the cutting room floor. There's nothing in there. It all got used, baby.
Yeah. Well, I guess one thing I didn't know the plot of Ben-Hur when I'm going into it. So maybe we should say just like the basic.
Yes, like certainly something. There is things like the Dunning-Kruger effect and curse of knowledge, where you've known things for so long that you forget how you've learned them, and thus you're confused when other people don't know the things that you know. And sometimes I'm a bit like this with my film experience because, as I've mentioned before, my family had partial ownership of stock in video shops for a long time. Too long, in fact. We should have pulled out much sooner than we did. But it's meant that I saw all sorts of things that, over the years, I've realized weren't a part of many people's experiences in how they learned about film. And so I saw Ben-Hur at around the age that I saw many strange mixes of films. So, summarizing Ben-Hur.
Yeah.
The base plot of Ben-Hur is that Judah Ben-Hur, a prince of Judah, funny enough, who are currently the nation occupying Jerusalem at that time. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Israeli history around this time.
Not really. I know, like, I just know that vaguely that they were always kind of a bit difficult for the Romans to control after they conquered.
Oh, yeah. So, several centuries before, about the nation of Israel had a civil war and split off into two separate states. There was Judah, which held ownership of Jerusalem, and thus access to the temple and most of their central national identity. And Israel, which held most of the rest of the territory. And at various times, they both underwent invasions and long periods of occupation. Israel was invaded by the Assyrian Empire, and Judah by the Babylonian Empire. And eventually, the remnants of both of those states came back, reclaimed their lands, then went right back to the civil war and bickering, and returned to being an Israel and a Judah. And that was when the Roman occupation began. And right from the get-go, yeah, there were revolts. There's a book of the Torah, which is what Christians and most Anglo people would know as the Old Testament of the Bible. That's the majority of the books of the Torah, the book of Jewish history and law. One of the books which isn't considered part of the Christian canon, but is in some Catholic Bibles, is the Book of Maccabees, which is the historical documents of the Maccabean revolt, which is important because that is where the traditions of Hanukkah come from. Which is why a lot of people from a Christian or generally agnostic background have been impacted with pop cultural stuff about Christian traditions, but not things like Hanukkah. It's just not in most Christian canons.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I might have heard a little bit about that revolt. Is that the one where there was a big siege at the end?
Yes.
And then at the last minute, they basically just all started committing suicide before the Romans could finally break through?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so I know a little bit about that then. And yeah, that's the backdrop of both these other films that we watched, right?
Yeah, so that's within about 50 years of the birth of Jesus.
Okay.
And of course, the birth of Jesus coincides with Augustus Caesar ascending to the throne that has now been conveniently left open by the assassination of Julius and the brief periods of political strife and civil war that happened there.
So much fun.
Roman history is a very fun list of petty power struggles and assassinations.
But over such a big, large empire, so it's like it's just
Yeah.
so interesting. Like these petty squabbles between people, but the
ramifications,
yeah,
because of those who are in power. So yeah, the census, the famous census, which triggers in Christian tradition and is the reason that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, is because that's where Joseph had to go as part of the census. The reason Augustus decided to do the first ever empire-wide census was as a means of consolidating his power and ensuring that everyone understood, yes, the leadership is secure, there is procedure again, there is law, that is why you must go to your designated place and do this thing. This was also around when Augustus commissioned the Ennead. Are you familiar with the Ennead?
I've heard of the word, but not.
Alright, so the Iliad is a story told by Homer.
Oh, Iliad. Sorry.
No, so the Iliad is a story told by Homer in in the Greek Iron Age.
Sure.
Most of which is probably fiction, because when people have looked for things like the islands of Mykonos in the way that Homer describes them, it does not match the culture that is on the island of Mykonos. It's where, like, Agamemnon, the great, nasty, conniving general lives, but all you can see is evidence of trade. And pages and pages and pages of documents of, here's the clay pots we shipped. So the Iliad is, of course, that great war epic about the Battle of Troy and the legend of Achilles. And the Ennead is a story that Augustus Caesar commissioned to a writer called Virgil, who wanted to have, since, of course, this is where the divine right of kings is transferred to the emperor, that the emperor is a divine ruler. And the way that he tries to justify this in public consciousness is he commissions Virgil to write self-insert fan fiction of the Iliad that it claims that Augustus Caesar is directly descended from the Trojan bloodline and is therefore a true Italian prince, and also got the approval of the gods.
Is that the one where, I'm not sure if there was like one person or a small group from Troy escaped
Yes.
a big fight, and then they founded
Rome. Because they give birth to Romulus and Remus and so on. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, state-funded fan fiction, which is a perfect way to bring into that Ben-Hur is itself a piece of Christian fan fiction. Now, of course, the other fun tie-in that I can bring up now is if you're familiar with Dante's Divine Comedy, that one of the big running gags in that, essentially, the Divine Comedy is itself a form of Christian fan fiction, starring Dante as he achieves some degree of Gnostic enlightenment. He also, his guide through hell is Virgil, who's been condemned to be touring around because of the blasphemy he performed by writing state-sponsored fan fiction claiming divinity to the emperor.
This stuff is all so much more interesting than
They're
Ben-Hur.
talking about Ben-Hur, yes.
Roman fan fiction is better than Ben-Hur. While also showing just how amazing Rome is, that even random fan fiction that they made tends to be quite fun.
And Renaissance Italian fan fiction, apparently. So the plot of Ben-Hur, with all this out of the way,
God.
is basically a fanfic of the Gospels, in particular the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, where this fellow called Judah Ben-Hur, who's a rich Jewish fellow in the time of the Roman occupation, he is rich and he's privileged. His family clearly were supporters of the occupation because he grew up with Roman citizens who would eventually get appointed to the post of tribune, partially overseeing the governance of the region of what was dubbed by Rome as Judea. And he's very briefly torn about whether he should stick to his country's roots or to support the Roman occupation, decides to stick to his country's roots, then gets punished by Messala. Then a series of accidents occur which allow Messala to justify arresting Ben-Hur and using him as a symbol of fear and subjugation. Gets Ben-Hur thrown on a galley, condemned to die. Ben-Hur, through some series of coincidences and fortunes and his own wits and strength, escapes the galley, winds up maneuvering through Roman politics, establishes that he's good at chariots, comes back to Judea to get revenge against Messala, and find his family again, who were also imprisoned at the time. Pretty much your classic revenge plot. I'm making this sound a lot better than it is. If you want this plot done better, you should check out The Count of Monte Cristo. There's some fun film adaptations. If you like long reads, it is a fun book to read. There is an anime called Gankutsuo from about 2004 by Studio Gonzo, which is The Count of Monte Cristo in space! Visually spectacular. All of these are better than watching Ben-Hur, because those little comments are made about the central conflict and his ideals. That is the first 10 minutes of the movie, and is then ignored for the next 2.5 hours.
Yeah, I think I made the comment during the movie that there was a good movie hidden away. Or a good story hidden away.
That story is The Count of Monte Cristo.
Yeah. I suppose I'm not sure how long the Count of Monte Cristo adaptation movie is. But,
shorter than this.
Yes, shorter than this. I bet if you just like cut away the amount of movie to Count of Monte Cristo's running time, you'd probably have a better movie. And I think you're also forgetting the fantastic Act 4.
Oh yeah, so before we get to the... Yeah, let's get right into Act 4. Like I said, this film is Christian fan fiction, and so a recurring element of the film is that he has Ben-Hur, while he's being sent to the galleys and he's walking through the desert on chains, he's refused water, but Jesus Christ of Nazareth appears to give him some water. At the start of the film, in particular, it sets the tone by showcasing elements of the story of Jesus' birth, and the period is framed in the context of Jesus' birth. You get this great big Anno Domini before the year to assert, yes, look at all the Jesus in this movie. And then the film ends about 40 minutes after the intermission. He has resolved his plot thread he's gotten his revenge, he has found his family. You could maybe wrap things up with how he treats people with leprosy, but it then immediately goes to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and it does the entirety of it in order to indicate these characters, they were there too. Look at them watching the torture and the crucifixion of Jesus, the passion as it is sometimes referred to. And they were there too, and because they saw, they are cured of their leprosy. That's how that plot thread is resolved.
Yeah. Which
makes for terrible storytelling, terrible structuring, and feels incredibly contrived.
I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this in a film before, where I've obviously seen movies that have been over long, or maybe with pacing issues, but to have it essentially end its Act 3, which is usually the final act, with him getting revenge on Messala. Sort of. It's not like he stabs him to death or anything like that. But either way, Messala is dead.
He beats his ass and humiliates him. Yeah. It is tied into ideas which are discussed earlier, which is that it's more valuable to win in the marketplace of ideas. Yeah. Is, in modern parlance, I guess, the sort of attitude that they're taking. But basically, that rather than shanking him, you should be making more of a statement in a non-violent way. And this is a way that they would be able to convey Christian ideas of selflessness and loving your enemy in a way that would make sense for the context of a revenge story. But then he just beats his ass in a race and lets Messala get horribly mauled. Yeah. Yeah,
and that ends Act 3, and then out of absolutely nowhere,
now they're gonna see the Jesus things.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever quite seen anything quite like this. I've seen long epilogues, but usually those epilogues have something to do with the story that has just been told.
Yeah, it's about recontextualizing what you've seen in the conventional story component.
Yeah, this just felt like a tacked on maybe another hour.
Yeah.
Of just after he wraps up his main story thread, he then finds his family, who are lepers, and then takes them to watch Jesus get crucified. and then they're cured of the leprosy.
Yeah,
Was
the idea that I guess it's trying to get to with his story is that he's accepting them, and it's about them understanding that they can accept his love for them, which is a very Christian idea. It's a key component of faith-based salvation. But it does a really bad job of running parallels of this with Jesus. And so it's just Charlton Heston frowning a bit and carrying someone briefly. And then just long, agonizing shots of Jesus carrying that cross, getting whipped, getting taken up, getting crucified.
Yeah,
And they were there too, I guess.
That literally is the plot thread of that Act 4. They were there too.
Yep.
And yeah, I know I'm sure we'll get to some other stuff that the movie had, but I really wanted just to get to talk about that first, because that's my lasting impression of the movie.
Yes.
That horrifically long final act that it really does, it sours everything else in a movie that already isn't that well told anyway.
Yeah. It's like I made that video about Krampus a couple of months ago, where my point with that is that the ending of a movie is not only your last chance for contextualizing what has been shown so far, but it will leave the final lasting impressions that will stick with you whenever you think of that text. And this is a tremendous example where it just is such a long, meandering, dull and meaningless thing. It's very, very cynical. It is here to say, hey, look, hey, Christians, you should come watch our movie. It has the Jesus thing in it.
Yeah. It's amazing that, looking back at that video on Krampus, criticizing that ending, which now looks perfectly fine, really.
That's me grumping about 30 seconds.
Yes.
I was, and am still considering doing a follow-up video about the film Wonder, where that movie went for about 10 minutes too long.
Yeah.
And it really annoyed me there because the film had a perfect emotional beat to end, where all of its plot threads had moved together and converged. And you could have even taken the closing monologue that the film uses and put it 10 minutes earlier when the plot threads are converging at a play. Because basically, that's a film about a kid who's got physical deformities. He's ugly on the outside, but beautiful on the inside. It had the subtlety of a brick, but it's a film that's made for kids and families to watch, and so it is a valuable film to have. What was neat about the film is that he had an arc as well, because, quite often when you're doing a story like this, the main character will be utterly perfect.
Yeah.
Whereas his arc is about understanding that everyone else is going through shit as well, and that you've got to learn to empathize with them, and that everyone struggles in their own way. And part of how it achieves this is it periodically switches perspective to a different minor character in the film, and you get an insight into what they're thinking, what they're going through, and how he's impacted them, and also a bit of how they've impacted him and him learning from that. And so that really all comes together at a play that his older sister is in as an understudy, and the friend who she's been having problems with, she's having problems not so much because she's gone evil, like the film suggests early on, because she's basically going through imposter syndrome and thinks she's nowhere near as good as the main character's sister. And so it culminates that character's arc ends with her faking illness so she can let the person who she admires actually step to the forefront for once. And so it all comes together really nicely as this little moment where he understands to empathize with others a bit better, and they'll understand how to be more compassionate. But then the movie goes for another goddamn 10 minutes, where suddenly now the main character's on a school field trip, and they're camping out in the woods, and then some friends beat up some bullies, and then the evil kid, whose plot thread had been resolved earlier, suddenly his mum does a hissy fit in the principal's office, and then there's a big school ceremony where they do the big speeches, and the principal makes a speech assuming the audience is morons that didn't understand anything this movie was about. So he does a speech about, people can be really talented, but they need to be kind. Intercuts with shots from throughout the rest of the film. Matt is turning away here, embarrassed at how unsubtle this is.
Yeah.
The movie assumes you're a moron, so it's really aggravating like that. But perhaps my favorite part the weirdest part of all this, not only is it edited differently to the rest of the film, not only does it have a fixed perspective unlike the rest of the film, but right when it's hit those emotional beats and the movie should be rolling the credits, it then cuts to the field trip, and the editor clearly knows that this is the wrong decision to make, and that he has to find a way to get the audience to perk up and pay attention again. So much like that cockatoo that was forced into Citizen Kane, the loudest music cut in the film happens where just obnoxious pop rock plays as loud as possible while the kids are on the field trip, just to wake up the audience and say, "Oh, it's not over yet, you gotta keep watching." It's so bad!
And I think what's interesting about you talking about that and talking about Krampus is that we're talking about being annoyed at
30
Krampus,
seconds.
30 seconds. Then with Wonder, we're talking about 10 minutes. And that's just, and you were able to show just how wrong things can go just with 10 minutes over time.
Just with 30 seconds.
Or just with 30 seconds of overtime.
And this is well over 40 minutes.
Yeah, there are other things to talk about with Ben-Hur, but I really wanted to get to that immediately because it really does make a film that is already not that pleasurable, at least for my mind, to watch, and it just turns into a real slog. And
So let's talk about something else that's unpleasurable about this film.
Sure.
The romance.
Oh.
The alleged romance.
Well, there is a really good romance in the first 10 minutes.
Yes. Yeah, so we'll get to that afterwards.
Sure.
First, man sees woman, woman sees man. Yeah. Woman is going to be in arranged marriage elsewhere, decides not to because she wants Charlton Heston with his many, many teeth and his NRA license. But they can't, but then they see each other again years later and they can. They have about 4 scenes together.
Yes.
Zero chemistry. They want each other because in Hollywood films, the man must have a woman.
Yeah. There's no real relationship between them. They kind of just look at each other. And I think it's really good for you to say there is no chemistry. Because it's not just that they don't have any much lines of dialogue, many scenes to be in. Even the scenes that they are in, there's just nothing really there. And it's one of the most loveless romantic plot lines I've seen for a while.
There are times when you see a pair of characters together, and right from the get-go you go, I want to see more of them together. That is an entertaining dynamic. There's something about these personalities, or their tone of voice, or their aesthetic, that makes you want to see that thing. None of that with these two.
Yeah.
But Judah Ben-Hur and Marsalis in their first scene together.
Yes.
These two men want to fuck. They really want to fuck each other.
Well, it's
so hard.
It's the complete opposite of what happens between Ben-Hur and the lady character. I completely forgot her name. Who cares?
She's a non-person, Esther.
Yeah. Oh, well, there you go.
You know, like the queen who was married to a Babylonian king and did clever things.
I remember. I actually remember that now. I remember that. I really like the name Hester. I remember thinking to myself, God, it's a shame that such a cool name was given to such a non-character.
The name of such an iconic, strong female character from the Bible is given to the trophy on the mantelpiece.
But there, as you say, there is chemistry between Charlton Heston's Ben-Hur, and I'm not sure who the actor for Masala is, but they show up. They meet each other very early on in the film. It's with the Tribune, I believe, at first.
Yes.
And he's talking to one of his aides or something like that, just giving us an impression of what's going on in the city. And then Ben-Hur arrives, and like the smiles on their faces, the joy.
These are two guys who really, really love each other.
Yeah.
So hard. And they have a line where they're talking about the fond memories from when they were boys. And of course, the catchphrase they use is down with Eros, up with Mars. Eros being the god of sex, the Roman version of Aphrodite, because the Roman pantheon is the Greek pantheon with a different skin, because the Romans really wanted to be Greek.
Yeah.
So yeah, like the point here is, of course, that they're saying down with sex, up with war, as part of the joking boys will be boys are got to be violent. The usual sort of mentality of the time. that being the 50s when this film was made. But there's also a certain implication here because Greek and Roman tradition had a variety of different words for love, with eros specifically referring to penetrative sex, and there being a variety of other filial and unconditional, using that line to really say, yeah, you know, it's brotherly love. But you watch this, certainly with modern eyes, and it's just, man, there would be so many fanfics written about these two right now based on this scene.
Yeah,
and I'm totally down for it. It's so much more an interesting couple.
Yeah. And they're so touchy-feely with each other as well. Like, they're constantly grabbing each other's hand and, like, trying to lead them away somewhere. Especially away from other people. There's a lot of scenes at the start of the film when they, one of them will grab the other by the hand and sort of lead them away to a dark or, like,
a different corner of the room.
Yeah, where no one else is around. They only have eyes for each other. They just want to talk to each other.
They want to talk to each other, followed by those beams crossed. The line, are the beams still crossed? Followed by grabbing a spear, hefting that spear into the wall, and then Ben-Hur striking the exact same point with his spear. Man! It's a shame that this film doesn't run very heavily on semiotic imagery, because oh boy would you be having a field day with this scene otherwise. It's the best part of the movie.
Yeah.
It's better than the chariot race.
It is. Yeah, but I actually found we'll get to the chariot race eventually. I'll just say that probably was a bit disappointing to me in the end. But with these two, even if you did take out the romantic aspect, it's a real shame about this relationship between Messala and Ben-Hur, just because I said before there was a good movie hidden in this 3 and 45-minute runtime, and one of those things is just two people who are friends were making fun of they should be lovers, but either way, two people who are very important to each other.
Yeah, two brothers who are bound by fate, but torn by political divide.
Yeah. And
that is a classic story that you can be heroic, you can be tragic, you can have so many tensions. You can make it a story about revenge, you can make it a story about lost love, of failures of the tragedy, what loyalties actually matter. Is it to your faith? Is it to your family? Is it to your country?
Yeah. Or your friend.
Or your friend. These are all things that the film comes so close to discussing in those first 10 minutes, and then abandons for this long slog back to where it began. And again, very briefly touches on those themes once again, before again casting them away for long scenes at that point of cutting promos. They cut promos on each other for a while, then have their race.
Yeah.
And Ben-Hur wins, and then, oops, it's time for the Jesus thing for the next 40 minutes. That's Ben-Hur.
Yeah, they,
We've gone for 40 minutes already.
Wow. Well, we talked about other things as well. We talked a little bit about Wonder and such like that. I would say that you said before that it doesn't rely much on semiotics, and I feel like that's a good point just to put on, just to talk about a little bit, just in that it really struggles, I think, with visual storytelling in general, this movie.
Yeah. This film has epic scope. There's scenes with huge volumes of extras dressed in Roman gear doing long marches through streets and through countryside. There's these incredibly elaborate shots using a combination of miniatures, matte paintings, and projection to achieve a naval fleet battle. There's the chariot race, which is, again, lots of rear screen projection combined with huge amounts of trained animals and elaborate stunts, incredibly elaborate stunt work with lots of doubles and stunts and really dangerous shots. Lots of synchronization and timing required, because there's bits where extras are pulling away a failed competitor on a stretcher, and they are narrowly avoiding getting run over by the racing horses by like 2 seconds.
Yeah.
If they were a little bit slower in that take, they would have died.
Yeah. There's that, and that is very impressive. Like, the amount of extras and those kind of visual scenes are quite good.
They're spectacular to look at, but there's nothing to them. Your brain just shuts off and goes, look at the thing. But the brain's not thinking, what is this thing? What is being discussed here? What does any of this mean?
Yeah,
It's excess for its own sake.
Yeah, like I think I wrote down my notes that the primary way of conveying information in this movie is through dialogue.
Yep.
And in some ways, I think I think primary might not even be correct. It might be the only way in some way. Like, it might literally be the only way that information is conveyed in this film. It's certainly more primary than it should be, considering that it is a movie and it's a visual medium. And a lot of...
It's well past the time where semiotic understanding had been developed to a certain degree.
Yeah. Like, just for a few examples, or even just one or two, I remember at the start of the film, they talk about that the city of Pichy is in a bit of a crisis. Like, there's obviously a lot of tensions. Like, people are upset at roaming rule. There's rabble and rioting and stuff like that.
Yeah, people in dialogue say there's rioting. You never see any indication of it.
Yeah. And there are scenes where, right before they meet, we see them meet each other again, Ben-Hur and Masala. Masala says, "Oh, I knew him. We were like brothers." They have to convey that through dialogue when they really didn't have to say that at all, because as soon as they see each other, they start hugging. You could convey that information just by their reactions to each other.
Yep.
And it's that, and those are just two examples, and that just goes through the whole film of just like, it doesn't really know how to convey information through a more efficient manner, through visuals, through, just showing us instead of telling us. And it's such
I made a joke while we were watching that Roger Corman is in some ways an unsung hero of Hollywood, because his burning passion for efficiency and doing things as cheaply as possible wound up having this impact on the directors who he mentored in prioritizing efficiency in how you convey ideas to people. Basically, his stinginess led to genuinely creative people applying that in order to more efficiently convey information.
Well, it's said a lot, isn't it? Like a lack of resources or a bit of a struggle.
Triumph through art through adversity.
Yeah. And it's it certainly some extra efficiency would have helped this movie quite a lot. Yeah. I will say one scene that did look really good and probably did have a little bit of visual storytelling, and one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie would be the rowing scene.
Yes. It's also just about the only interesting editing in the film.
Yeah.
Because the rest of this film is almost entirely structurally oriented editing. It's just convey the story in sequential order. Here's these flat, medium-length shots of two people talking, maybe sitting on a couch. You very rarely get shot reverse shot as well. A lot of it's just the one flat angle still.
Yeah.
And the two examples I can think of with things like perspective shots is when Ben-Hur's just lying on the ground and staring up at the sky. And then suddenly Balthazar... I didn't mention that, but this film and the book it's based on helped cement in general cultural awareness the idea that there were three wise men, Balthazar, Melchior, and Caspar, rather than an indeterminate number of magi.
Yeah.
That appeared. It might have been 2, it might have been 50. So, the other editing is the rowing scene, where you just get these shots of Charlton Heston just heaving and striving and struggling, interspersed with these shots of the Roman centurion just looking at him, partially menacingly, partially as a test. Like, there's interesting stuff here where the intercutting, the montage of Charlton Heston and the Roman leads you to thinking about what they're thinking about each other.
As well as just, we're talking about, like, impressive visuals in a general way, like the synchronization of those rowers and just getting all those people in that little room.
Yeah, that's like 50 extras, all working perfectly in sync.
So I think that's such a good scene, and it shows how disappointing it is that there wasn't more of it, because, you had that great chariot race and the great naval battle, and this just shows that if you had a little bit more to it, like you had a little bit of visual storytelling, that it's amazing how much you have the great organization of getting all those extras to work with each other, and you have the great editing and the great kind of like visual storytelling of the console looking at Charlton Heston or Ben-Hur and like little kind of mental struggle that they were having with each other.
It's like, to use an example from a film that is generally considered not as good as its predecessor, one of my favourite parts of The Dark Knight Rises, the climax of the Christopher Nolan film trilogy, since that's the film which has by far the most extras, is the scene towards the end when Batman and Bane are attempting to punch each other, because it's a superhero movie.
Yes.
And there's this massive swarm of people for Batman and for Bane just punching each other in this gigantic mob sprawl.
Yeah.
And it's visually spectacular, the coordination going on in this shot. And it's also in service of just accentuating how these two men and their two ideas have impacted a large number of people.
Yeah.
So, like, the conflict is in service of the story, and the technology and the techniques and the excess, because Christopher Nolan's certainly a man of excess, is in service of bigger themes and ideas.
Yeah. It's always nice when you have like a harmony going on and those things kind of coming together rather than with Ben-Hur, other than the rowing scene, it's just excess for the sake of excess.
Yep.
There's no real point to it.
It's big to be spectacular to sell tickets.
Yeah.
You will come and be bedazzled. You'll see the rizzle and the razzle.
I'm not sure if this is a good comparison, but I wonder whether, in some ways, this is like the old version of what CGI is for us now, where we'll have like a big CGI fest kind of blockbuster movie, and we'll say, well, it's really just for the spectacle rather than the story.
Last time we were complaining about the CGI heavy fight scenes in Spider-Man 3.
And I guess before they had CGI, the version of that they had in the olden days was just let's just throw in as many extras on the screen, and there you go. Yeah.
And much like we'll get to some, when we get to them, we'll find films which have good examples of excessive extras and props and sets. Yeah. Much like every now and then you get a Mad Max Fury Road, which may be the greatest use of CG in film history.
God, I could have used a bit of Mad Max Fury Road while watching this film.
Everyone could. There's a reason it's one of the greatest action films of all time.
Yeah. I know we've already talked about this movie quite a lot, but there was one thing that I did want to talk about, and that was just the abuse of time skips.
Oh, yeah.
This film, I don't know if it's...
Perhaps we should put this into modern context.
Sure.
There is a film in cinemas right now called Ready Player One, which is based on a novel by one Ernest Cline. And one of the many, many, many problems of that book is how hard that abuses time skips. If you've read the book or seen screen caps of quotes, it'll do things like, I went to the fitness planet for 3 months and trained really hard, and now I'm super fit and really, really shredded. And that's awesome. And so the timescape of the timescale of the book is about a year.
Sure.
The Steven Spielberg movie is set over 36 hours. That is how hard they can. That's because all the plot points that are thematic and important do not require these large gaps in time. So you can just contract it right down. And then Ben-Hur, of course, has the time skips you're going to mention now.
Yeah. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that time skips in general are bad or...
I can think of a good example of a time skip.
Yeah, there's always... It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. It's just when they're abused is when I have a problem with them. So what? I know there's
3 years on the galley.
Yeah, 3 years on the galley was the one that really annoyed me. It wasn't the only one, but it was the one where I went, oh, for fuck's sake.
The first, two of them did that to you.
Yeah. I think with the galley, it's just there was no sign. Like I think there's like a few different reasons why time skip can be bad, and I feel like this had all of them. And first of all, it wasn't even clear that there was a time skip to me. In that,
nope.
There's no, usually, like, there are ways that you can kind of, like, show to a viewer that there's a passage of time. Usually it's through a montage, or even just through...
Usually through good makeup.
Yes.
Frankly, makeup is the single easiest way. Yeah. If someone has been condemned to slavery on a slave galley for 3 years straight, you just use makeup and clothing to make them look really haggard and worn out. But of course, he's got to be a tough man, so he's gotten more buff by this.
Yeah. It basically after he's imprisoned because of a crime he didn't commit, they think that he tried to kill the governor. He's sentenced to be a slave on a galley, which is a ship. He's like a rower kind of slave guy, just rowing a ship forever and ever. And so it shows a little journey through a desert, apparently to the ship. I actually really struggled with that. I thought he was just a regular slave until he just showed up on a galley one day. And then...
Well, there's only one line. In a 3-hour, 45-minute movie, you can only spare one line to indicate that he's going to the galleys.
Yes. it's strange. Sometimes it overdoes most of its stuff, but then it'll just have a few little things that
It
comes
stretches
vague
the
on.
trivial
Yeah.
and shortens the relevant.
Why does it do that? Sorry, we're talking about the time skip, but there's just so much shit in this movie that it's difficult to stay on topic. Yeah, and so he's rowing on the ship, and he's talking to the centurion or the consul, the guy in charge. And the guy in charge just randomly just says, 3 years you've been on this ship. And then I think it was even more. I think
And a day short a month.
Yeah. And it's just, oh, okay. Is that okay? So I hate it because I hate it because transition is bad, but I also kind of believe that when you abuse time skips, the problem is that you kind of just undercut any character development. It's kind of like a really cheap, lazy way to have a character be one way at a certain point in the story, and then just say, "Oh, they're different now."
Well, let's unpack that comment a bit more.
Sure.
Stories and stories that are driven around a character arc, which, if you hold to modern myth theory, is every story ever written, is essentially the story of characters changing. And so when you have skips in how they're changing, then unless you're making a point about rapid changes in personality, then you are cheating people out of story.
Yeah.
Is what you are doing.
Yeah, and this cheats us incredibly. And I think, and then the next time skip that happens is after.
It's 1 year, merely a year. The next one.
Oh yeah, just merely a year. But even so, I feel like even though it was a lot more years in the first time skip, I feel like in the second time skip, even though it was only 1 year compared to the 3, 4, or 5 on the galley, I feel like his character changes more in that 1 year, and so it actually feels worse.
Yes.
So after he saves the Roman consul in the naval
Perhaps
battle.
we should contrast this. So,
Sure.
the first time skip, his state before it is that he's been wronged and wants revenge, and his state after it is he's been wronged and wants revenge.
Yeah.
So it's mostly a physical and mental state of the moment-to-moment life of a slave that you're being cheated out on.
Yeah.
The next time skip, though...
Yeah. The next time skip, after he saves the consul in a naval battle, which the Romans apparently win, but doesn't really matter. The fact is he saves
Pyrrhic
him,
victory.
Pyrrhic victory. And the consul takes him back, and he is basically awarded Ben-Hur as a slave, which I guess is better than being a slave on a galley. And then a year passes. Once again, very little showing transition. That's probably even worse, that one, because there's a ceremony happening where he is given to the consul as a slave, and then immediately the next scene there's a ceremony happening again, which feels kind of the same.
Yep.
And then
It feels like he's at the after party of the first one.
yeah, there's very little sign of time passing. But then the consul says that Ben-Hur has been racing chariots for a year and has won 5 races. And I once again got pissed off because of the lack of showing us. And then, as you say, his character now is much more calm. He's happier. He's clearly had a much happier life.
He's more compliant with Rome.
Yes.
He sees the consul as a father figure.
Yes. That's so many changes. It's a change on how angry and bitter he was. It's a change on how he views political systems. He has a new relationship with that father, with the consul, as you say, being a father figure. That word cheated is so good to describe how bad this time skip is. That's a movie in of itself. Someone changing their opinions and gaining a new relationship and becoming a chariot racer from a galley slave. That's a story in of itself. And it's just skipped right past.
Yep. Can I compare this to a good time skip?
Sure.
There is a television show from 2007. It is animated and from Japan, called Tengen Toppa Guren Lagan. It is a show about manly men who use phallic imagery to overthrow a post-apocalyptic government. And then 7 years pass. And then the second half of the show happens. And it's a brilliant time skip because essentially the character arcs have all been resolved at the midpoint of the show. And so then what happens is they've gone from this very bare bones post-apocalyptic environment to really, really rapid technological and urban development. And so the main character, being the one who killed the bad guy, is the president. And he's still he's still the kid trying to work out what he's doing. But now he's also been thrust into nuanced political and civic problems. And he then has to understand what leadership means in an entirely new context. And it's wonderful to watch.
Well, I guess what you're saying, especially there, is he's had a character before the time skip, and there's no reason for his character to change that much in the intervening period.
Yeah,
and then
the circumstances have changed, but he has not yet changed.
Yeah.
So the temporal shift is relevant and important for the next changes in his life. I guess you could compare that to, say, how Pixar films are often built around establishing that a character is a fully realized person at the beginning, and it's about them accepting the changes in their life that are about to come.
Yeah, so...
Pixar discussion in your Ben-Hur podcast.
I think, in discussing this movie, we've talked about how the time skips aren't done well. We've talked about how the love story is not done well. We've talked about how it doesn't seem to understand how visual storytelling works. We've talked about pacing problems. It's every particular part of how this story is told feels wrong.
Yep.
It's so when I started when we started talking about this podcast started, and I talked about how much I hated this film. I'm hoping that at least by talking about some of those things, you understand. I really feel like every part of this movie
doesn't work.
Yeah. And when you have a story that is so long and is so bad, it's just it's a drudgery of an experience, and I hated it.
I think that just about covers everything that we needed to talk about directly with Ben-Hur.
Sure.
So, we watched another film set in the exact same time period, made 20 years later, Monty Python's Life of Brian. Where to begin with this one?
I guess I'll just start by saying I hadn't watched this film.
You aren't...
This is the first time I've watched this, yes.
Beyond pop cultural osmosis, you haven't actually seen much of the Python's work, have you?
No.
Thinking of an excuse to do Holy Grail now.
Yeah, I used to have to find something to pair it up with. Yeah, why don't you tell me a little bit about Monty Python? Because I struggle.
So, Monty Python, there is a reason that I chose this. This was kind of a stars aligning moment. Because this week is not only Passover/Easter/ oh god, look at all the chocolate day. It's also the week that Pop Team Epic finished its broadcast run. Now, Pop Team Epic is a comic by a Japanese fellow called B-Cub, which is one long string. It's a self-described terrible comic. It got an animated adaptation. And the comic is just lots and lots of self-deprecation, non-sequitur, vulgarity, and absurdist humor. And it's tremendously good at it. It's wonderful. I could try to explain panels of Pop Team Epic, but just seeing strips, and you'll either get it or you won't. And it got an animated adaptation, which went for 12 episodes. And the way that I've described this to some people is that it's a lot like the transition from The Goon Show to Monty Python's Flying Circus, where The Goon Show was a groundbreaking radio comedy show throughout the 60s, and then Monty Python's Flying Circus was an absurdist comedy sketch show that really took some of the things The Goon Show was trying to do with Spike Milligan, and just taking them up to a whole new level, and taking advantage of being in a different medium to really, really play around with how that medium works, and what sort of jokes you can do, and what conventions there are, and this has really been a case like that with Pop Team Epic, where the comic is these wonderfully bizarre jokes, and the TV show would sometimes just present the comic as it was, just with voice acting and some miniature motion. Sometimes it would pretend to be a different show. Sometimes it would do 6-minute film parodies. Sometimes characters would just break out of the frame and do something else. Yeah, the episode previews were all advertising a completely different show to what you're watching. The show had 20 minutes of TV time as per the norm, but it only went for 10 minutes each week. So the second half would be the exact same episode, but the voice actors have been replaced. They advertised a set of voice actors that only used them once. There was a week. Oh, sometimes it would just do stop motion music videos. There's points where it had a set visual style, but then it would hire a bunch of other animators who would only send in the first draft of how they've drawn out their keyframes. So it basically looks like childish scribbles sometimes. They would also voice these segments themselves with placeholder audio, and just that would be the final product you'd get. There's one time they decided that wasn't any good, so instead of animating it, they just drew over some sketchbooks and narrated the sketchbook storyboards in a sequence that is incredibly well choreographed. Sometimes the second version of the episode, when it does the repeat, sometimes that second version would actually alter a bunch of the jokes. Wonderful little surreal experience, and it just so happened that it ended the exact same week that we watched Life of Brian.
I can definitely see a connection to how Monty Python operates.
So yeah, Monty Python was essentially a bunch of boys from Oxford who studied some literature and some theatre and some classics, you know, your Oxford humanities stuff.
Yeah.
Where you just kind of faff around and be in the boys' club. And that's very, very prevalent throughout their humour. It's that very, very highbrow British. A bunch of people who want to be larrikins, but also have a certain societal expectation to be smarter than they are. And so it's this mixture of being smug and also just being lowbrow when you can get away with it. Mm. And yeah, it very much played around with absurdism at the time and just what is television? How can we work around with it? What is the structure of how you tell jokes, and how can we mess with that structure? If there's jokes and lots of just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. So, hey, we're shooting this sketch and it's the ending's just not working, so we'll just make the punchline that we just walk out on the sketch halfway through. Or, we've been ramping up the absurdity too much in this episode, so a chief of police is going to arrest us because the sketch is being too silly. Someone's just going to start calling out the cheap props that we're using in a sketch. Like, that's not even a proper keep left sign. We were here for a perfectly wholesome sketch about killer bikey grandmas, and you're just ruining it with these fake vicars and keep left signs.
Yeah.
So then the movies.
Yeah.
So yeah, and the first movie, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, is very much that sort of thing applied to a film environment where we've got a bunch of sketch ideas. It was also, some of the Pythons worked with Terry Gilliam. Terry Gilliam was a long-time collaborator. He was an American who became a British citizen. He was the animator for all the animated sequences before he got into film separately. And it was after they finished it that people asked, well, what are you going to do next? And so Michael Palin and Eric Idle said, well, what'll be a controversial answer? Jesus Christ, lust for glory. And so then they sat down and actually read the Bible trying to work out how to do such a film. And the end result is they went, well, we can't really make jokes about Jesus because there's nothing here to mock. And so what we instead get is this fascinating film. And for the record, I am a Christian. And I've been in Christian environments many times over the years where segments of this film have been used to discuss Christianity and Christian ideas, because what it looks at isn't Jesus, but people and how they respond to the message of Jesus, as well as lots of jokes about the politics of the time. So, the rebellion against Rome, institutional power abuses. There's some really interesting moments of second-wave feminism throughout this film. It's a film that is very definitely made by educated men, and both for good and for bad. They're certainly men. There's jokes, like, I would say the main themes of this film are radicalization. The complacency of being in academia is a running gag in this film. There is, like I said, there's a streak of second-wave feminism is absolutely a part of this film. For reference, what I mean when I say second-wave feminism is first wave of feminism is turn of the 20th century. That's women's suffrage. The central arguments and theories that were being written by feminists were discussing the need for women to have the right to vote. Whereas second wave is through the 60s and 70s and is much more interested about women's roles in society, in the workplace, sexual agency, and personal independence and agency. And like the depiction of there's a particular woman throughout this film who is basically all these things. She makes up her own mind. She's politically engaged. She's an activist. Her sexuality is entirely hers and operates on her own thing and isn't the only thing she's fixated on, which leads to that wonderful scene where she has had sex with Brian and all Brian wants to talk about is the sex. And she's going like, we've done that. It's time to get back to work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you talk about all these things when, you know, like when I watched the movie, it's also a movie that has a scene where Roman soldiers start laughing when a guy has to say biggest dickus over and over again.
Yeah, this film,
also,
that's what makes this film so fascinating. This is a film I've seen many times. And the first time you watch it, it's very much just this wash of these jokes, and some of them are clever jokes, some of them are very sloppy jokes, some of them work, some of them don't, but like the themes of this movie are really good and fascinating to go over again.
I think for me, just personally, I struggle with trying to come up with, think about themes in such a absurd as kind of surreal kind of movie. I usually like it when it's more to have something that is a little more grounded. If you're going to talk about like these kind of themes, like about radicalization, about about feminism, about stuff like that, mob rule, stuff like that, and you're talking about complacency and academia, like those kind of things. Like I think because they are important, I guess I kind of assume...
You prefer there to be more gravitas when discussing them?
Yeah.
I mean, like this is the core of what satire is. Is that satire can be absurd, and the point is that your politically charged humor is using the ability to laugh and get emotional attachment to your product that way to get people to listen and think about ideas, as well as highlighting ideas that are absurd.
Sure.
Because, like, every scene with the People's Front of Judea, and certainly the joke where they introduce that there's this large variety of radical groups who all don't have the same sort of goal, a good comparison. Certainly you could comparison to, say, extremist Islamist groups looking to establish the caliphate and the absolute mess, chaotic mess that they are, and sometimes you get a more successful group like an Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, or ISIS, and then other times they will just vanish and none of them work because they're all so fixated on their own personal goals and greed that they're not actually interested in benefiting others. They're not interested in establishing a church state for the benefit of others. It's not, the caliphate is less important than we are the ones who hold the caliphate.
And those some of the best, funniest jokes that happened in the movie were based around Judea's People's Front and just its general goings on, either with them arguing with other potential groups or just their inner workings in general.
The jokes are very much... I've been involved in convention management for many years. There were a couple of years when I was younger that I was involved in university clubs. So those scenes in particular where the Judeans People Front are just making votes to propose motions which must be seconded, which are to gain approval to create another vote and form another sitting committee. I have been in those meetings with those exact procedures. Just pointless flim-flam and bureaucracy for its own sake.
Yeah. I guess something I would say is that even though it was very obvious to me what they were making fun of when the movie was happening, you know, and even though it was funny because it's so absurd and there's nothing like behind it, I struggle, I guess, to like it's not really gonna last. I don't think Life of Brian's gonna have a lasting impression on me. And it didn't really tell me anything that I didn't already know.
That's always the problem when you're watching something you agree with, for the most part.
Yeah, fair enough. But it's also like it's not like you're not going to connect with anyone in Monty Python's Life of Brian. Like, there's no characters that are in any way in depth enough for you to establish a connection to.
Sometimes I feel that Graham Chapman's Brian has just enough emotion and frustration at every facet of his life that he can be a relatable figure of this guy who's trying to do some things and trying to do the right thing, doesn't really know how, and no one's actually helping him. And almost everyone in his life is just interested in taking advantage of him.
Sure. But then there's a scene where he jumps off.
He falls off a tower, and it's a Terry Gilliam space opera.
Then, he then falls into a spaceship. Like, you can't... I guess it's probably more a fault with me than the movie. It's just, I can't really... I'm not going to get emotionally invested in something like this. And because of that, the themes, while, like, interesting and good, and I can say, oh, it's a good theme, I can't really get into them in the same way.
Yeah, you can academically appreciate the construct of this film.
Yeah.
But you cannot emotionally engage with it. You can understand it, but you don't feel it.
Yeah. And I just personally, I think that it's better if you can. I feel like if you can create a story, whether it's a TV show or a movie or whatever it is, and you have some themes that you'd like to explore, let's say if it's radicalism or, you know, the stuff that Life of Brian talks about. If you can also make characters in a story that you're really invested in and you feel like you're a part of that world while watching it, I feel like it's that much more powerful. But I don't think the people involved in Monty Python have that ability. I don't know they're that kind of people because they are, you know, they're, as you say, Oxford club boys who, while and it almost feels like a meta commentary on them as well. It's like they know these things are important, but none of these things...
That's not important to them.
Yeah, and it's never going to be important to them. Feminism is never going to be important to John Cleese, really. Not like... maybe that's a bit
important in the context of can he make a joke out of it and make money from that joke?
Sure. Like, obviously, I don't know them personally. I can't get in their heads. Maybe there are some issues to them that are really important. But, like, in, like, a practical kind of way, you know, it's not going to affect their lives that much. The horrible things that happen in the Middle East is not going to affect them that much. They are rich, well-off people who can just make jokes about this. And so they can make absurdist humor, and they can make these kind of, like...
Well, they can make politically driven absurdist humor.
Yeah.
That it's very much an important part of humor is, as a social tool, is that humor is at its most effective and valuable to people when it's involving punching up. Where you use humor to protect those who are powerless and to highlight the absurdity of some of those who are in power.
Yeah, maybe I'm being a bit harsh on them then. I don't know, it's just for me. It feels like...
Yeah, I mean, this is the beauty of... This is part of the subjectivity of art. For me, Graham Chapman, particularly by the end when the film is just overtly screwing him as much as possible, is... And may even be that I know the dark place that Graham Chapman was in at around this time. And that probably impacts how I feel about his depiction throughout this film, where I know that he's in a pretty bad spot at this time. And this is like the last glimmer of hope before he goes back down that abyss and dies.
Right. Yeah, I can't speak to that. I mean...
like, art can affect people in different ways, and sometimes things that connect well and are well constructed, sometimes they just don't connect emotionally.
Yeah.
If I can use another anime example, going to be doing lots of this. There's an absurdist comedy from about 7 years ago called Nichijou, The Everyday Life. The joke of the title is that everything that happens in the show is completely insane. It'll be something like, a girl is in a park, and there's a dog. And so she throws a frisbee, and the dog runs after her, and she throws another frisbee, then pulls out her trap rifle and shoots both the frisbees and writes down on the scorecard. She's trap shooting.
Okay.
Like... joke after joke of wonderfully absurdist stuff like that. Like, here's a guy riding on a goat. Why is he on a goat? Why is he not on a goat? Why aren't you on a goat? That's the joke. Here's a guy and he's gonna talk in haikus for a bit. And my brain sees this, and a lot of the visual depiction of these jokes in the animated adaptation is visually spectacular. It has some amazing use of the language of film and animation to convey the jokes and really make them stronger. And every time I see it, my brain says, that is a well-constructed and humorous situation. And then I don't laugh.
Yeah.
It doesn't resonate with me emotionally.
And yeah, I guess that it can be difficult to pinpoint exactly why, like, because when it is subjective, it can be tough to work out what things help you connect with something and why you might not. It's not to say that I didn't like this film. I guess it just means it's hard for me to talk about it in terms of like interesting concepts. Like, as I say, it really feels to me like people who can afford to make fun of it without really going that deep into it. You know, you can
people making the jokes not because they matter to them, but because they're in a position where they can safely do it without repercussion.
Yeah, and as well as not just repercussion, without really being there. So it's like a surface level joke. It's like, yeah, we all know that, you know, the Middle East can't get its act together in terms of, you know, having peace and prosperity.
Hey, having no enlightenment phase is pretty bad, huh?
Yeah. But it doesn't really go into. It's like the difference between Monty Python and in the Loop.
Yeah.
Where In the Loop is able to get you invested into working out the inner workings of the system that it's having a satire on, I much prefer watching In the Loop than I would like to watch like Life of Brian or the Monty Python sketch show.
Mm-hmm.
So I also think of, this is probably a pretty mainstream example, but I was thinking a little bit of like The Simpsons, like especially those early seasons, the way that has humor that's really sharp and biting at times of like institutions and.
Oh yeah, because it's all about punching up as here are a bunch of working class, less well-to-do people, and just how hard all the systems that make up America screw you over.
Yeah, and I feel like that in The Simpsons, what it does is that by focusing on one family, and it's able to give you an emotional investment and attachment to even
and it also plays off the visual language of the sitcoms, which it is so relentlessly destroying.
Yeah.
Like, these are the things, and it uses a lot of the techniques that those family sitcoms use to make you attached to them, and then just pulls the rug under you constantly.
Yeah.
Hey, I guess, you know, sometimes stories don't have an ending. It's just a bunch of stuff that happened.
Yeah, I guess the reason why I'm thinking about, like, Simpsons in the thick of it is just, like, other examples of using humor and satire to...
Iconic politically driven satire.
Yeah. And it just so happens that I appreciate them a little bit more than I appreciate Monty Python. Mm-hmm. Or maybe this is all just coming down to the fact that I hate the animation style of Monty Python.
You don't like Terry Gilliam animated shorts.
And that is poisoning everything.
Look, we need to watch The Killer Cars, then you will understand.
Yeah. Otherwise, I did laugh at this film. There were a lot of jokes that I really quite enjoyed. And after Ben-Hur, it was a very... I think my notes just wrote, "Oh, thank God, it's Monty Python." After
it's like you see the vague shots of the Sermon of the Mount in Ben-Hur, and then you followed up with the first scene after the credits of Life of Brian, which is of course Jesus delivering the same sermon on the Mount, and the joke is people are too far away to hear what he's saying clearly, and the gross misinterpretations of wisdom that occur just because of the logistical concerns. Mm. Then followed by the wonderful scene of Brian's mum wants to go to a stoning. Women are not allowed to be involved in stonings, so she buys a beard to disguise herself. And every single person who is in that stoning audience is a woman with a beard pretending to be a man.
It's probably a scene that I think about it. There probably is a fair amount to unpack in that scene. There's so many,
there are so many scenes.
Segments.
Yeah, like I said, this is a film which is well worth seeing multiple times because you can unpack a lot more of what it's doing when you know what the jokes are. So you're instead looking at what they're actually discussing, the further ins and outs of each scene. Which means, do you have something you wanted to say?
Oh, I'll just on a personal note, I've always appreciated jokes about people not being able to hear things. I feel like it's because that's such a massive trope in fiction, especially like television and movies, but probably also books as well. Just like people somehow being able their voice is carrying huge amounts of distance.
Yeah.
And you see that in any kind of story, whether it's like a Jesus doing a big rally, or like in robot stories where they're shouting at each other. Yeah, I've always appreciated that joke, so I like that.
Yes. So, transphobia in the life of Brian. It was there.
It was there.
It's for people who think that you're being witty with... Certainly this is a couple of weeks after that Ricky Gervais stand-up routine did the rounds, which is just the laziest punch-down humour. It's Ricky Gervais whining that people ragged him on Twitter. Look at how not mad I am by how much I talk about these nobodies on Twitter and how they dissed me. These jokes here, this is much earlier into an understanding of transsexuality. Much earlier. And like this is pre-AIDS epidemic levels of how LGBT was understood. And it's the same level of joke that you often get in transphobic circles. So, like, your red hot take of, lol man, I identify as a woman now you cannot oppress me. Look at all these babies I'm not gonna have. This is a 40-year-old joke.
Yeah.
And it's the least funny joke in that scene. Because that's a scene which has wonderfully incisive jokes about extremist groups, about ideological differences, digs at crappy fast food jobs, and the most wonderful, absurd mockery of a gladiator fight you've ever seen. Where it's just one armored guy, one borderline naked man, and he just keeps running around until the armored guy dies of a heart attack.
Where he literally says, "Oh, I think I'm going into cardiac arrest," and then he just falls over and dies. Yeah, I guess this probably is a little bit unfair. It's probably better just to say that it's
a sign of the times.
Sign of the times. My thought essentially was just that it goes back to that example of or that theme for me of these guys get to make jokes about things that don't have any repercussions for them, or things they don't actually have to understand that well. Mm-hmm. And it kind of just fits in that same kind of pattern and mold. It's just probably the first thing that came to their head when they thought about trans people. Mm-hmm. That they probably didn't think about it for more than 30 seconds. And they're like, oh, this is a joke. They can't actually have babies. And they just put it in the film. They didn't have to think about it because they don't have to think about very much. Because they're rich white guys who get to make movies like this.
So I think that just about covers it for this week. Yeah. Thank you for listening.
Goodbye.
Shall I put a preview of what we do for next week?
Sure, yeah.
I haven't worked it out yet.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for listening. Talk to you next time.
Goodbye.